now that we have covered the crossroads between religion and the theory of evolution, the scientific theory, and kind of established that in science, the questions are different than the questions we ask in religion. We're going to go through the evidence which is compiled for in support of evolution and some of the holes that were kind of put into it along the way. Now, this picture is from the Scopes trial, which we talked about, where a teacher was on trial for teaching evolution in school when it was against the law. They went through a lot of the evidence of evolution during this trial, even brought in a chimpanzee at one point. But that's not how theories in science are debated. They aren't given a court of law and then proved guilty or not guilty. It's an ever-changing ebb and flow of information. And so we'll present that information as evidence here and talk about how evolution is, under our current understanding, the best explanation for the many living things around us. For the reason why we have species, for where they came from, how they got here, and also the current changes which are happening to species. So evolution was first proposed by two scientists in an essay written in 1858, presented at a conference, Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace. You see their pictures at the top there. There's a young Darwin to the left and then old Darwin below. Darwin had put in a significant greater effort in this theory, but Alfred Wallace also came to these same ideas, and when someone who knew them both and was kind of discussing these theories with them both, discovered they were both doing the same thing, urged them to publish something together, and so they did. Some of the main tenets were descent with modification, so through generations they are different than their predecessors, and that leads to changes in traits in a population over time which matches their environment, or best suits populations towards their environment, and that's the basics of evolution. Darwin formulated his theory by collecting a lot of different evidence from economics, geology, through expeditions he went, and we'll review those now. First, he was a bit of an explorer. He didn't do, at the time, there were many expeditions which would go around the world looking for different resources, and Darwin accompanied one of these voyages. It was called the HMS Beagle, and he published a book on it as well. He did do a lot of collections when he went to this island called the Galapagos Islands, which is off the coast of Ecuador. I actually was able to go there myself. It's an amazing place. He, however, was not very organized when he made his collection. So he got all these finches, and they have different beak sizes, but they were all the same finches. Whereas on the mainland, you would find a bunch of different birds from a bunch of different species that weren't all related. Here, all the finches then filled all the different niches. They had different beak sizes. Later, other scientists studied and kind of put together that they must have come from a common ancestor and then diversified. But this did have an influence on Darwin and his ideas and thoughts, especially all the different organisms he saw on his travels. He also read an essay by an economist named Malthus, and he wrote an essay on the principle of population, basically stating that you have a lot of people that are born, not all of them survive to adulthood, so there must be a mechanism for accounting for some of them surviving and some of them dying. And you have these graphs here. If everyone survived, you would have this exponential growth rate, but that's not what happens. Instead, we have more of a geometric growth rate, that red line. And Malthus's main point of this paper was at some point we're going to run out of resources because the growth will exceed the number of resources available, and there will be then selection. So this was kind of working in Darwin's mind, similar to how animals and plants and living things, lots of them are born, but not all of them continue to adulthood and survive and reproduce. So there must be some sort of selection occurring. All right, he also looked at a book by Lyell, who was a geologist at the time. He read this book, Principles of Geology, which looked at the geological formations and all the different layers, the strata, and concluded that they must have formed over long, long periods of time, millions of years, which was against the current theory, which was that everything happened, was created over a few thousand years. And this was important because that theory, evolution, his theory of evolution, Darwin's, was that it would take a long time for species to evolve. And it didn't coincide with the current geological theory until this came out. It was like, oh, well, millions of years would be enough time for species to change, populations to change, and to account for the diversity that we have. All right, so Darwin was a pigeon breeder. And here, with pigeons, and also we do this with lots of different organisms, but agriculturally, but also dogs. So dogs all descended from wolves, where we domesticated wolves and then we selected for certain traits and to provide a very variable amount of different breeds that all look like different species, but they're not. They're all the same species. Pigeons, the same. You can breed them into all different colors and shapes and sizes. And so if we can artificially create differences in populations, that would then propose that, well, maybe this variation can occur naturally as well. All right, so Darwin published his book in 1859. I've tried to read it, and it's not great reading. It's kind of hard to follow, very meandering, but in it contains the ideas which lead to our current understanding of evolution, again, with descent with modification and natural selection, so selection by the conditions within the environment. It received a lot of criticism at the time because it did not propose a method of inheritance, so how traits were passed from one individual to another. The fossil record was not complete, so it didn't really, it had all these kind of what seemed to be unrelated fossils, and so it didn't show a clear line from one species to another. And again, the age of the Earth was thought to be thousands of years old rather than millions of years, which would have taken for evolution to account for all our different species. However, after Darwin had published and then, eventually died, a lot of evidence added to the theory. So first was genetics. So Gregor Mendel, as we all know, is the father of genetics. His work was discovered in the early 1900s. So he actually published his works at the same time that Darwin was publishing his, but they just didn't make a lot of people didn't notice it, and so it wasn't, the two weren't put together. But once they were discovered, then it was like, oh, well, here is then our method of inheritance. Genetics. Genes are passed from one individual to another in a variable amount, especially during sexual reproduction, which we've covered before. So now a mode of inheritance was discovered. The fossil record is now much more complete, so a lot more fossils were found, including those you could consider missing links, right? So you have a bird and you have a dinosaur, and one of those missing links was called Archaeopteryx, which showed characteristics of both birds and dinosaurs, so a link between the two. some examples of these, which are more complete now today, we have fossil records of horses, lots of the variations between whales, and even human evolution. There are lots of variations of hominid skulls, which show changes in populations in different time periods leading up to humans. After genetics, we then discovered DNA as the inheritance pattern. We discovered how to locate DNA on chromosomes with genes, and we could then use those genes to compare genes between different species. Previously, we organized organisms based on their morphological characters, but then we can now add on top of that another layer. Oh, let's look at the similarities in their DNA, and we find that DNA adds clarity to a lot of these relationships, DNA similarities, but also a lot of it is pretty similar. So if their morphology is similar, often their DNA is very similar as well. And this can also be traced to show a common ancestor. All living organisms have DNA, use DNA as a method of inheritance from one generation to another. All right, so when looking at bones, living organisms, or fossil records, you can look at their anatomy and see that a lot of the things which are important in a human or a dog or bird or whale that you see here, a lot of these bones are the same bones. Sometimes they have the same number, sometimes they're reduced, but the structure is generally the same. So all four of these have a humerus, all four of them have a radius and an ulna, but they've been modified for the specific use. So a whale has a very short and thick radius and ulna because it has flippers, so it can swim. A bird has short and hollow, or sorry, long and hollow bones, so it can fly. A dog has a very pronounced elbow for its running ability, and so on and so forth. But the same bones are there. If a bone has the same function but a different structure, it's called a convergent trait or an analogous trait. Whereas a homologous trait is something, or structure is the same structure but may have different functions. So those that are highlighted in this picture up here are the homologous structures. They're the same bones, but they have slightly different use depending on the function of the organism. All right, so again, this denotes, all right, well, there must have been a common ancestor, and then they were slightly modified as they became different species and inhabited different environments. Comparative anatomy, so looking at development. So this is sometimes called evo-devo, evolutionary development. Sorry, I don't have a better picture here, but this is what I can find. Basically, when you look at things embryonically or as they develop over time, you find greater similarities as well. One of these sayings, which has been kind of said over as a common phrase, ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. Basically, that is, development shows relationships in evolution. And so you look at a fish, amphibian, reptile, bird, and animal, they all look pretty similar at the early stages of development. And the differences that occur can also be traced through evolutionary relationships. All right, again, this is showing a common ancestry. Same reproduction, just modified over time because of different environments. All right, information since has also confirmed Lyell's theory that the age of the Earth is billions of years old, with living things inhabiting all the way back to 3.5 billion years ago. So, and animals up to 500 million years ago. So this is enough time for evolution to take place and account for all the different things we have. Biogeography is looking at the organisms in different areas and looking at how geography then can predict. So basically, the environment is based on the geography, the climate, the conditions which affect individuals living there. And we can find that those predict what characters might inhabit the organisms there. And we can look at different animals found in different biomes, and will have similar characteristics. So these are 3 foxes. An Arctic fox has characteristics which are different from a desert fox because it has a different environment. But 2 foxes found in different continents but with the same environment, so these are both desert foxes, have similar traits, and that's because the large ears will allow heat to radiate off of their ears so they can maintain the heat. They're more slender off the ground. The conditions of their geography, their climate, then create similarities, and that's called convergent evolution. All right. Again, natural selection, the environment itself selects for certain traits which promote populations which have those traits matched to their environment. All right, vestigial structures. So these are structures that organisms have which don't really have a function. This is a big argument against the theory of intelligent design. So if something was designed intelligently, you wouldn't put random things which have no function in there. And it also shows common ancestry. All right, so a whale, pelvic and limb bones. So they have legs, bones, but they don't actually do anything. They don't have any legs. They're just embedded in the blubber, and they just float in the blubber there. So that's a vestigial structure. You also find similar structures in snakes, which also don't have legs. Humans have a lot of vestigial structures, including wisdom teeth, not really functional. A tailbone, we don't have tails. The appendix in humans has little to no function as well. All right, so there are some examples where evolution has taken place. One of them is soapberry bugs. So you have these fruits in Florida. One of them was introduced, and one of them is natural, and they have different length to get to the food which is in the fruit. And what this has created is 2 different populations, one of which would feed on the flat-potted golden rain tree fruit, and one of them which feeds on the balloon vine fruit. And over time, this has created 2 populations with different length of proboscis that will then go and eat the fruit. You can see that, the red graph and the blue graph. All right. So selection by their environment, something different, has then created differences in the population. That is evolution. We've seen it take place. Unfortunately, we also have evolution of things which infect us. So one example is MRSA. This is methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus. This is a bacteria which can infect your skin, which is resistant to the antibiotics which we have developed to treat them. And so this can become actually a life-threatening disease sometimes. People often have to have their limbs removed. The level of MRSA is increasing over time because our antibiotics are less and less effective as more and more of these cultures of bacteria continue to survive. All right. And this is through selection. So our inadvertent selection towards resistant bacteria is the environment we've created, which has caused this population of bacteria to evolve this resistance. Now more and more of the population is resistant. Another example is silver foxes. So this is a color morph of red foxes. And researchers in Russia took a population of these and decided they were going to tame them. So they bred them over and over for domestic traits. What they found was they exhibited this, they were just looking for the temperament of the foxes. Can you get ones that will be friendly towards humans? What they found was the traits that they selected for also selected for traits similar to found in dogs. So they have floppy ears rather than straight ears. They have a tail which lays down between their legs rather than one above their body. And so the thought is maybe this is a pleiotropic effect, that traits found with domestication, which is an environmental, artificially selected, but environmental selection pressure, then selects for these convergent traits that you find in dogs as well. I would love a pet fox. I actually looked into getting one, but they are $7,000. That's not money I'm willing to spend. Maybe SVU could give me a bonus, a silver fox, if everybody gets an A in this class. So it's on you guys, okay? Also, foxes have been somewhat domesticated, but they are still foxes in temperament. So this is another kind of interesting fact about that articulates the point about evolution. You can domesticate them to a point, but they still have fox characteristics. So they still have their vestigial traits where they will dig and hide and chew and act like a fox. And they aren't social creatures like dogs are. Dogs are from wolves, which have packs and social structures, and so they have to kind of they're already in an environment which would lead itself to be tame. At least some individuals would be submissive to the dominant individuals. Foxes, not so much. So they're always going to have these kind of fox characteristics in their genetics. All right, I think that's it.